Hello class. I wanted to take just a few minutes of your time to walk you through this week's homework so that we could learn a little bit about causal arguments and how we might go about answering these questions. Let's do it. So here's our homework, and the instructions asked you to analyze each of the following causal arguments, and I gave you 5 of them. You were to identify the conclusion, so you could type the conclusion out, or if you're using an annotator or some other program that lets you draw on it, you could underline the conclusion of the argument. You're going to tell me which method the argument appeals to, right? Does it appeal to the method of agreement, the method of difference, the joint method of agreement and difference working together, or to the method of concomitant variation, or the method of correlation? But note, your conclusion might be implied and not stated. This happens often with arguments in the real world. We don't always see therefores and so forth, right? The conclusion might just be implied. And then last, you're going to indicate whether the argument is strong or weak. This is basically asking whether the argument fits our pattern. Our patterns are good patterns. So long as something fits that pattern and fits it closely, it's a strong argument. It does provide probable support for its conclusion, which is a causal claim because we're dealing with causal arguments. So let's at least do one together, the first one of your homework, and then I will let you work the rest on your own. Here we go. So there are some key terms. One, we're dealing with causal arguments, so we know the conclusion will be a causal claim. Causal claims might be in the form of cause and effect. Factor A caused phenomenon E, but it could also use language that sounds causal. So it might say A was followed by E, or E was caused by A. It could also say things like A led to E. So just keep your eyes open for language that sounds causal. And if you're ever unsure, it's okay to hedge, right? You can say something like, this sounds like the causal claim that this argument is supporting, even if it stops short of assigning causality, right? So it's okay to be a little more precise if we need to. And strong versus weak. These are the terms that we use to evaluate inductive arguments. All inductive arguments, whether it's an enumerative induction, whether it's an analogical induction, whether it's a causal argument, or whether it's an inference to the best explanation. These arguments are not described as being valid or invalid. Those are terms we reserve for deductive argument forms, such as modus ponens or modus tollens, back from our argument structure section. We use terms strong and weak to describe good or bad inductive arguments. Strong inductive arguments have conclusions that are probably supported by the premises, or that are supported probabilistically by the premises. Weak arguments have conclusions that are not probabilistically supported by the premises. The one difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments is that with new information, an inductive argument can change from being strong to being weak. Whereas with new information, a deductive argument will never change from being valid to invalid. That is something that can have a technical proof behind it, but just so you know, when we're dealing with inductive arguments, we always want to be on the lookout for new information or information that might have been overlooked. That could change our determination as to whether the argument is strong or weak. Okay, so here's the first problem. 45 patients were admitted to Mercy Hospital for pneumonia in December. They were all given standard treatment for pneumonia. After 5 days, 30 of them were well enough to go home. The other 15, however, somehow acquired other infections and were not well enough to be released for 14 days. The only relevant factor common to these 15 is this. They all stayed in the same ward, different from the ward that the other group stayed in. Something about staying in that ward is the cause of the prolonged illness. So the first thing I always do when looking at these is I always find the conclusion first. We might appeal back to our Chapter 1 indicator word section and look for premise indicator words to help us find the conclusion by elimination, or conclusion indicator words to help us find the conclusion more directly. In this case, we don't have any of those. So keep that in mind. We're going to find the conclusion first, and we're going to rewrite the problem so that it comes close to our argument structure, and we're going to put the conclusion last. So our conclusion is number 2 in this case. Factor A, staying in the same ward, different from the ward as the other patients, was probably the cause of E, which in this case is prolonged illness. And our premise was factor A, staying in the same ward, was followed by the prolonged illness, so that those patients couldn't be released for another 2 weeks. So if we rewrite the problem, it looks like this. Factor A was followed by E for 15 patients. Factor A was probably the cause of E. Which of our four methods do we think this is? Well, it's not method of concomitant variation. We do not see two factors being varied and looking for as to whether another the phenomenon co-varies with it in intensity. We don't see the method of difference. So if we don't see difference, we can't see agreement and difference. So it has to be method of agreement, right? There's one factor, and when it's there, you get the illness. So if there's a factor that's there, and then you get the illness, that's method of agreement, right? What is it that these 15 patients have in common, and such that they were all sick? They all agree in that they stayed in the same ward, right? That is the relevant factor. So you would say this is the method of agreement. Now, is it strong or weak? It's strong, right? It fits our pattern. If there are 15 patients in a hospital and they all subsequently continue to get sick for 2 more weeks and they all stayed in the same ward and that's the only thing they have in common, I mean, you better believe that hospital is going to be disinfecting that room and cleaning it because that was the cause, right? Like, we know that's the cause. Like, it's intuitive. It makes sense. It fits our pattern. Could it be something else? Yes. With inductive arguments, there is always risk that there is some unidentified factor that's really doing the causal work. But we live in the real world, and sometimes we have to go on not perfect information. In this case, our information is actually really good. I mean, 15 patients stayed in that room, and they all had prolonged illness. You know, what else do you want? But note that we can't determine whether the argument was cogent or not. So typically when we're evaluating arguments, there's 2 steps. Step 1, for inductive arguments, we ask whether it's strong or weak. If it's weak, throw the argument in the trash, you're done with it. If it's strong, you have to ask a follow-up question. Did this argument start with good information, true information? You don't need to ask that question if the argument's weak because it's already an unconvincing argument. Save yourself some time. But once the argument does provide probabilistic support for the conclusion, then you want to know if those premises really are true. But of course, in this case, it's a made-up argument. There is no need to ask that question. But you may be saying, so suppose you worked through this on your own and you looked at it and you said, why isn't this agreement and difference together? After all, those 15 patients that got sick, they agreed in that they all stayed in that same room, but there was mention of the other patients that didn't stay in that same room and then didn't get sick, right? They were all discharged early. Why not have agreement in the case of the 15 patients and then method of difference by noticing that when you take away staying in that one room, you take away the prolonged illness? I see your point, right? It looks a lot like difference. But the way the structure of method of difference is presented in our text, it's presented as a way of eliminating a factor when there are multiple factors. So you have factor A and B that were, let's say, followed by prolonged illness. And then you know when B is gone, you lose the illness. By elimination, that leaves A. So think of method of difference as an eliminator of factors. In our case, it's not as if we have a couple of different factors that we're trying to wrestle with, and then we use difference to narrow our search down. We only have the one factor. These patients stayed in this one room. That's the only thing they have in common. What else is it, right? We don't need to eliminate some second option. We don't have a second option. It has to be the room. So that's why in this case, the best answer is method of agreement and strong. Okay. I hope this short video was helpful in thinking through the problem. You're going to do similar things for the other problems. I like to start by identifying the conclusion first, writing the argument in as plain a language as I can so that it comes close to the structures presented in our textbook, and then ask, is it strong or weak, and what's the method? If you do that, you're going to do great on this homework assignment. Thanks for taking some time with me.